could've. Maybe I didn't treat you quite as good as I should've. If I made you feel second best, girl, I'm sorry I was blind. But you were always on my mind. You were always on my mind.
Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Fredericksburg. We are situated on the ancestral homelands of the Rappahannock and Potomac tribes, where enslaved people were forced to work on the land. We acknowledge that this land holds many histories, great stories, and the blood of a people.
Love will make a way where there seems to be no way. It works in ways we cannot see. Love will make a way for me. Love will be my guide. Hold me closely to his side. With hope and strength for each new day. Love will make a way. Love will make a way. By a roadway in the wilderness, it leads me. Rivers in the desert will I see. Heaven and earth will fade, but this love will still remain. Love will do something new today. Love will make a way where there seems to be no way. It works in ways we cannot see. Love will make a way for me. Love will be my guide. Hold me closely to his side. With love and strength for each new day, love will make a way. Love will make a way.
Good morning. I am Kristen Tuxbury. I use she, her pronouns, and I'll be your worship associate this morning. Here at the UFF, we come together both in person and online as one community. We strive to nurture learning, inspire spiritual insights, create compassionate relationships, and lovingly transform our community and the world. If you are joining us as a guest or a first-time visitor here in the building or online, we're glad you were here. Those in the building are invited to leave contact information at the welcome table in the foyer. For those of us joining online, you are invited to visit the worship portal on our website, uuffxbg.org, and fill out our connection card. Whether in person or online, this will allow our ministers and staff to get in contact with you in the weeks to come. Everyone is invited to fill out a card about a personal, significant joy or concern that you would like to have shared during the service. For those in person, you may pick up and leave your card on the Joys and Concerns table that is also in the foyer. For those joining us online, you are once again invited to visit the worship portal at our website and fill out a Joys and Concerns form. Our pastoral care team members will collect the in-person cards and read them during the service. For those online, your joys and concerns will be read at our next service. Please join us after the service for coffee and conversation. In that spirit of greeting, I invite us all to greet one another. For those online, please share your greetings in the online chat. It is so good to have you with us today. Is there someone from the pledge team? No one from the pledge team? Well, I'm not on the pledge team, but I can read. So we are at about, does it seem like a third of our goal? A little bit more? $116,676. Yay! We still have a really long way to go. Turns out if we can't pay our mortgage, we can't be here. So,
Who knew?
help. Yes, thank you to the pledge team. Yay. Yes, I will also say this later in the service, but there's online forms and there are in-person forms right out in the foyer for when you leave. You can write it down and then not worry about it.
Will their pledge write itself?
Their pledge will not write it. You need to do it. So, although if you pay by like direct debit like I do, it will still continue to come out. So you might as well write it down because you're still going to be paying it anyway. Turns out. There's that too. Like, as opposed to some other persuasions, we prefer that you decide how much to give us. Okay. Our opening words this morning are by Rod Richards. We who gather here in this tender and anxious and confusing time, we have been awash in a sea of information and misinformation and disinformation and this information that we seek to simply so that we can make wise decisions about how we respond and learn how we hold one another when we can't hold one another and decide how we can be when we can't be together. What is this that we face? How best do we respond? And why is this happening? The why, the why, the why. And why do those who suffer suffer most, always suffer most for what we now face? Why? And what can we do for those who are most at risk, most vulnerable, all the time, and now, again? And how do we respond? And how do we hold one another when we can't hold one another? And how do we stay together and stick together and worship together when we can't be together? Yet we are here. Here we are. We are here together. Please join me in reading in unison our words for lighting the chalice. All that we have ever loved and all that we have ever been stands with us on the brink of all that we aspire to create. A deeper peace, a larger love, the most embracing hope, a deeper joy in the life that we share.
And with that, we're going to sing our kids off to class. Yes? Mandolin, are you leading the way? You've got the light of love within you. Go on your way in peace. So let your light shine. The world awaits you. Go on your way in peace. I think they're gone.
Our reading this morning is by Palestinian poet Nadine Murtaja. There on the other side, time changes, hours pass, and it gets darker. The sky takes off its dim dress, then the morning arrives. But here where I live and breathe, life wears its black dress constantly, to mourn the labor of my land, which took a long time. Here, the hanging clock in my room is broken. Not only this one, everyone's clock is broken here. My mother keeps saying, everyone is waiting for the elixir. We had it with the grief and agony. In this holy land, we sleep and wake up to the sounds of bombing and shooting. So the first light of day rises in the evening, lighting up the sky with the blood of martyrs. Here death sleeps not far from us. We all walk towards freedom, towards hope. We walk on the shattered glass of our broken windows. We walk on the stones that once were a house, carrying stories and secrets. We walk with the screams of our children and the moans of mothers pulsating over and over in our ears. Our guest speaker this morning is Ranjit Singh, and he teaches international relations, Middle East politics, and environmental politics at UMW. As a field officer with the National Democratic Institute, Professor Singh helped to support the 1990s Oslo peace process between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. He lived in Israel, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip from 1994 to 1996. In total, he has spent about 7 years in various Arab countries as a student, researcher, or professional. He has a BA in political science from Mary Washington College, a master's in Arab studies from Georgetown, and a doctorate in foreign affairs from the University of Virginia. Audience members are welcome to Google his name to find out other facts and lies about him. Please welcome our speaker, Ranjit Singh.
Good morning. All right. And first of all, I would like to thank all of you for having me here today. I would like to thank Kristen for setting this up. and my friend Steve Watkins for inviting me months ago. I forget when it was, but something like October or November. And when someone invites you so long ago, it's easy to say yes to some nebulous date in the future. And it's a very effective tactic that Steve has used more than once, I'm sure, with people. But it's a great pleasure to be here. I was thinking about the last time I was here was in 2016, and I'm sure there was some precipitating event that caused an invitation to come here. I can't remember what that event was, but I do remember that I spoke about the late Israeli novelist Amos Oz, who wrote a book saying essentially that you can identify a fanatic by his or her lack of a sense of humor. And so, whatever the event was at that time, maybe it was the election of Donald Trump, or, today we talk about Hamas and the Israeli government, and I think it's safe to say that all three of those entities lack humor, and so they're probably fanatics in their own ways. So a lot of this still applies, but of course the precipitating event that occasioned Steve's invitation to me to come and speak to you was the tragic events of October 7th, and just kind of reflecting a little bit of what I was thinking at that time. For a day or two, I didn't pay any attention to the news. I heard about this conflict that had happened in Gaza and all of that, and I kind of filed it away when I was listening on the radio or something to just another tit for tat between Israel and Hamas, and didn't think much about it. And then after about 48 hours in the news cycle, it became very apparent this was something very, very different, right? Qualitatively, quantitatively, and so forth. It was going to be a defining event for many people. Even then, I took evasive action because I didn't want to go through the usual kind of university formalities, which is that when something terrible happens, you organize a panel of academics who talk about the history and contextualize everything and all these kinds of things. And those are necessary. I'm a fan of those, but I was just kind of tired of doing those kinds of things because they seem so futile, and usually people are all upset and whatever, and probably not really listening. And so instead at the university we organized an event actually very similar in spirit to what you do here, from what I have observed. We lit a candle and we brought in people from different theological traditions and just kind of focused on calming the place down, right? And it was somewhat successful, and what we really were trying to do was to avoid the precedent of 9/11. The event, October 7th, had a lot of echoes of 9/11, I think, especially for Israelis. And we all remember after 9/11, there was a lot of Islamophobia, anti-Arab feelings, and people got beat up unjustly, innocent people and things like that. And we wanted to make sure that the community, the university community, most of whom wouldn't remember 9/11, just kind of took a deep breath, a deep pause if possible, and remembered that we are a community. Well, that kind of got me thinking about how communities are reacting to the events of October 7th, and that's pretty much what I want to talk to you about today. And there's a curious kind of phenomenon unfolding from what I've been able to see kind of anecdotally as a professor at UMW. If you're familiar with College Avenue, which is right along the university there is a Jewish center that was established a few years ago. It is now, I believe, there's some new leadership. It's a Hasidic form of kind of conservative Judaism there. And then, 5, 6, 7 houses down, there is a private house that is flying a large Palestinian flag. And that kind of, just seeing that kind of evolve, I cannot remember, I was raised in this community, I cannot remember a time in which people flew large Palestinian flags. Generally wasn't something that you would see even when the tit for tat was going on, right? And that made me reflect a bit on the fact that apart from the vicious military battle that's going on in Gaza right now between the Israelis and Hamas. There's also an ideological battle going on here in the United States, right? And in political science, which is my field, we often talk about the importance of political framing, right? You know, which is basically just how issues are packaged. You know, if you package an issue a certain way, you can lead people to certain perspectives on that issue at the expense of other possible perspectives. And since October 7th, I think I can say that I've seen the frames that we are using to think about Israelis and Palestinians shifting in ways I've never seen them shift before, and probably faster than I've ever seen before. And I've been engaged in this since about 1990, late 80s, early 1990s, and perhaps irrevocably shifting. And that's what I want to talk about. If we look back at kind of the frames with which I think older generations looked at Palestinians and Israelis, and of course President Biden is famously a member of the older generation, but so are Donald Trump, although people forget that sometimes. You know, you think about how did older generations think about Israel, and you know, Israel of course was often seen as the product of the Holocaust. Right, you know, it was seen as a necessity of the Holocaust. Many of us were raised in a cultural milieu which would include Fiddler on the Roof, right? You know, musicals like that. I played a role in Fiddler on the Roof in high school, and you know, dancing around, and it had a narrative to it. You know, Jews being persecuted in Russia, seeking a home, you know, trying to find a home. You know, Israel, the young Israeli state, had one of the first female prime ministers in the world, Golda Meir. It was often associated with socialist policies, land policies, and things like that. So Israel was often kind of the darling of the left, right? You know, when I was growing up, and I'm sure when many of you were first thinking about that, and that frame justified for many people the creation of the new state of Israel in 1948. And the subsequent conflicts, the wars with the Arabs, 67, 73, and onward, kind of created an image that many Americans shared of Israel as this scrappy little democracy surrounded by antagonistical, usually authoritarian Arab states. That was, you know, and then you knew about like the rescue of the hostages at Entebbe, you know, kind of these heroic kind of narratives that were attached to the Israeli state. And that was certainly the frame that when I was growing up in the 1970s we were imbued with. I had relatives, I have kind of an odd family story with some German in it and all that, and we had relatives who would come from Israel and come visit us on a farm here in Stafford County, and my brother lived on a kibbutz in Israel in the 1970s, so we had that kind of interaction that fed into it. And then I think when many Americans of previous generations thought about Palestinians, you know, probably the first thing that pops into mind is terrorism, right? Terrorism, the Munich Olympics, 1972, the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, led by Yasser Arafat, a rather uncharismatic, kind of shifty-seeming figure, and that frame also easily can flow into an understanding which is ahistorical, but an understanding that kind of the actions of the PLO, the types of methods used by the PLO and the Palestinians flow into the Islamic State, and there's some sort of connection between them and things like that. And I think that was kind of an easy link for a lot of people to make, that yes, this is how Arabs express resistance and you know, through these kind of barbaric acts and all of that. And you know, sure enough, after October 7th, I saw some people saying basically, you know, Hamas is the Islamic State and all of this, although there's not really any, as far as I know, relationship between them, but you saw people exploiting this older frame as well. There's no denying that what happened on October 7th was definitely barbaric. I'll be the first person to sign on to that. But there's also no evidence that anyone's seen of beheading of children, right? But you heard Biden talking about it and these kinds of things. And, people kind of spin affairs into their own narratives that they think are going to be politically useful for them. And I think more broadly, when people thought about Palestinians, there was a lot of confusion in the past. People honestly didn't know where Palestinians are from. And I've had this experience as well as other people who've worked on this issue for some time now. I've actually sat down with staff from congressional offices in meetings in DC and elsewhere and had someone very intelligent, very educated ask, where are Palestinians from? They just didn't know. They were asking, where are Palestinians from? They knew where Israelis are from because they'd been, like me, dancing in Fiddler on the Roof, right? Or they'd seen, but where are Palestinians from? That was a question you would hear sometimes. And so what we're seeing in a lot of ways, I would think, is a transformation in these types of frames and these understandings of how we now locate contemporary events and what kind of context we give to them. And as someone who teaches undergraduates, people who are 18 to 22 years old who usually come into this issue without all the baggage that the rest of us bring into this issue, the transformation has been quite stark. In fact, for them, it's not a transformation, right? It's a formation, of their views, what's going on right now. And I can tell you for most of my students, because I do teach a class on this, their impression of Israel right now is that Israel is an occupying state. That's what they know it as, a state that occupies Palestinians. Their impression is that the Israeli government is an extremist right-wing government that openly uses racist language, as any number of the cabinet members of Netanyahu's cabinet have done, long before October 7th. That Israel is a settler country. It uses the term, or it doesn't like that term. They like to use other terms, but settlements in the West Bank. Well, who are settlers? Settlers are people who came, right? And they're occupying land, and that, for the younger generation in particular, kind of ties into notions of colonialism, right? As a colonial state, and there's nothing original about this image outside of the United States. For a long time, especially people on the left in Europe and in other areas, especially in the developing world, have talked about Israel as a colonial state, as a colonial outpost of Europeans in the Middle East and things like that. But it's new in American context to kind of talk that way. And then when young people, and I'm speaking in generalizations obviously here, but when young people talk about Palestinians or they think about Palestinians, of course, they think of Palestinians as anti-colonial, right? Again, it's an old idea outside the United States, but it's a relatively new one here inside the United States. They often see Palestinians as living in a context that is similar, or even some people argue worse than apartheid as it was in South Africa, right? And Palestinians are the darling of the left right now. So something happened, right? The Palestinian cause is the darling of the American left. Again, if you'd gone to England or something like that 30 years ago, they were always, the Irish and whatnot, they always supported kind of the Palestinian national cause. But in the American context, that's something new. And I think one of the more interesting framing devices that I've seen come up since October 7th, I'm sure it was out there before, but really on social media has exploded to the point I was quite startled to see how vividly people were using this, is to present Palestinians as indigenous people, right? The indigenous people of that area, of Palestine, which if you're on social media, on Facebook, on Instagram, all these kinds of things, I remember being quite startled in October to see very artfully constructed posts of Native American warriors, or with the headdresses. I don't know if the Navajo or Apache or something like that, doing their historic dances, their cultural traditions, and all that. Perhaps with a tomahawk or something like that. Very flamboyant, very powerful, moving imagery, and juxtaposed right next to that, Palestinian youth doing their national dance, which is called the Debke, which is a group dance, right? A very identifiable kind of thing. And people were merging these images with music, and they would go from the Native American to the Palestinian and then back to the Native American. And it's a very powerful image, whatever your politics, right? It's arresting to see that. And if you'd never thought about this issue before, I think most of our young people, all of us, know about our Native American history, right? And the deal that Native Americans got. And if someone's saying, look, think of Israelis and Palestinians like this. Young Palestinian youth, what are they? They're saying, this is our land, right? It's being taken away and all. It's a very powerful image to see. And I think that is, its ubiquity on social media has really been quite a change. And my students are all familiar now with these kinds of images, and they bring it up in the classroom. But the point of it is that, at least from an instructor's perspective and from just somebody who's interested in these kinds of things, these new frames allow for new discussions and new interpretations of what's going on. And I see that again a lot in my interactions with students. For example, a student will bring up the question, well, and they're smart. They know that historical comparisons are always fraught, right? History never repeats itself exactly, and obviously Native Americans and Palestinians are different people with different centuries and all of this kind of stuff. But also there can be some productivity, some usefulness to using these kinds of comparisons. And so students will come up and they'll say, well, how can we kind of think about Native Americans and Palestinians? What's real, what's not, all of this kind of stuff. And we end up playing around in the classroom. And one thing I really love about the federal government in the United States is that whatever we're up to, our federal agencies, our departments, tend to have really good professional historians. And I pulled up in this one class from the Department of Defense. They have an office of the historian, and the historians just do real good history of what the Department of Defense has been up to in the last 200 some years, right? And it's pretty divorced from politics. I think people leave historians usually alone. They probably sit in their own cubbies or something like that in the DOD, and they have their PhDs and whatever and stuff like that. So they come up with some really interesting historical takes. And I pulled up this list that the DOD Department of the Historians, and the History Department, puts together of all the wars and battles that the U.S. military has fought with Native Americans, right? And it's a long list. If I had a link right here, I would put up, and it even goes back to pre-Republic, like, the colonial days and all of that. And you scroll down, it's just page and page and page and page. Dozens and dozens. Some of these are full-on wars. Some of them are massacres. Some of them are just skirmishes here and there. Everybody has blood on their hands, lots of civilians wiped out on all sides and all this kind of stuff. But when you look through that list and you go through that process of just scrolling through so many conflicts with barbarities committed on all sides of those wars, it does kind of give you a perspective. I was talking earlier that on October 7th, I didn't really pay, or even the 8th, pay much attention to the news because I thought it was another tit for tat, right, between Hamas and Israel. These battles just are happening all the time. Sometimes they make the news, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they are just brutal massacres by one side or another. Sometimes they are more conventional military kind of conflicts and stuff like that. But for American students, if you make that comparison, of course, the underlying logic is known, right? Certainly, Native American tribes butchered American settlers, men, women, and children, and things like that. And certainly the American army came in and wiped out Native American tribes and all of this. But the underlying logic was one side was losing its land. One side was seeing its way of life disappear, and it was losing its land. And I'm not going to sit here and justify violence. That's not what I do or what I believe, but it helps you understand the context of things going on, right? And why I became kind of jaded after a couple of decades about just hearing of another shooting incident or another bomb going off or something like that over time. There's an underlying dynamic that is going on. It doesn't always justify what happens, but it makes it understandable, right? And other underlying dynamics like that. Some people have compared what happened on October 7th, and I'm not sure if this is a good comparison or not, but you see it out there, to slave rebellions, like Nat Turner's rebellion in 1830, I think it was, in Southside Virginia, in which a group of slaves got together, communicated very effectively, kept their plans secret, and massacred, I think it was over 50 families, and in Southside Virginia. It was put down, and Nat Turner himself was hanged, and all of that. But we all know the underlying dynamic. They were under a condition of enslavement, right, and desperate, and whatnot. And again, I'm not justifying the use of violence here, trying to understand the use of violence. And other people have done similar things with South African apartheid and all of this. But it leads to interesting conversations. And these are the kinds of conversations that were really hard to talk about, the kinds of possibly fruitful parallels that were really hard to talk about 20 or 25 years ago in a classroom. People would just shake their heads like, no, you can't, it's apples and oranges or something like that. And maybe it is, but it's an interesting comparison because it puts you in a new place in terms of thinking about things, right? What justice or injustice is going on? What motivates people towards violence, even violence we think is barbaric and perhaps unjustified, right? That's what political science and social sciences is all about, is trying to understand behavior, not necessarily to approve of behavior, but to understand where it comes from. And so, also because of close contact that we pride ourselves in at Mary Washington, close contact with students and all of that, I sometimes am asked by student leaders, what should we do about this issue? The more activist-oriented student leaders. And I know the president, I think is her title, of the Students for Justice in Palestine group at UMW. She takes one of my classes, and even after October 7th, I didn't know her very well, but she contacted me and she said, look, we want to have marches, we want to respond, we want to do our work, our activism as Students for Justice of Palestine. What do you think about this plan or that plan? And I was one of the faculty they would go to and ask our opinions. And I have to say, they never take my advice, which is, no, they never do, which is fine, right? They're a student club, I appreciate they come to me. I give them my best advice, and they've never taken it yet. I just sent them a long email about 3 days ago. I know they will not take anything that I say to heart. But what that does, though, is kind of demonstrate also that we're coming from very different places, right? What they think needs to be done versus what I think is probably more effective. There's not much in between. So they come up with these, you've heard about these controversies, right? These slogans, right? From the river to the sea, genocide, all of these kinds of things, right? They asked me, what do you think about doing this stuff? And I have to say, the first march I think it was the first march that they put together some point in October, I participated with them because I just wanted to show them support. I admire what they do. They're active, right? They're not passive. They're doing something. And I wanted to be in that march with them. I'm sure there's tape out there of me in that march with them, and they're chanting all this stuff. And I'm like, oh, God. But that's the risks you take, right? Sometimes. And but anyway, so they asked about from the river to the sea, right? Which many people find anti-Semitic. Other people just find, the Students for Justice in Palestine say, well, we interpret it as just meaning everybody should be free from the river to the sea, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean and all of that. My personal view of that chant is that whatever you interpret it as, it's highly ineffective, right, as a political chant. In the sense that if you have to attach footnotes to your chant, it's probably not going to work, right? And that's what I told them. You make your own decision on this. And there are, just to set the record straight. There are multiple interpretations of what that chant means. Some of them are older, some of them are post-October 7th. It is important to note that the political party of Benjamin Netanyahu has that same language in its charter, because they say from the river to the sea, this is the Likud party, it's all Israeli, right? So you talk to Palestinian activists and they will point that out to you. And again, I get back to my footnotes point, right? Are you trying to persuade people here or not, whatever the justice of your cause may be? I think one of the harder things to deal with, at least certainly for me, is the notion of genocide. Is this genocide? And not because I have blinders to what's going on. It's a massacre, what's going on. It's a massacre of innocence right now. When you get to 30,000 dead people, and reliable reports say 70 to 80% of them are non-combatants, that's just a massacre. But genocide itself, partly it's generational. It's an emotional topic. It's not a word that one uses easily. It's got a lot of history to it, but when you're 18, it doesn't. Right, and it's also hard to define. It gets into intent versus effect. I have no doubt that on Netanyahu's cabinet are some people who are perfectly happy to commit a genocide. Their past statements have said that. Do all of the people on the cabinet? No, I don't think so. Probably not, but I don't know. But again, in terms of political efficacy, if I was leader of Students for Justice in Palestine, I probably wouldn't use that word because I think there's better frames that can be used. One of the frames, chants that I suggested to them was, when is it okay to kill a child, right? I think that knowing their audience, that they are marching in Fredericksburg, they're not marching outside the Israeli embassy or something like that, they're marching in Fredericksburg. Know your audience, right? Most people won't have that much context, or they already have a context that's settled in, but who can answer in the affirmative when you ask a question like, when is it okay to kill a child? And there I borrow from the intellectual Naomi Klein, who wrote an article in The Guardian, an essay in The Guardian, not long after October 7th, when kind of the first concerns were really being raised about the indiscriminacy of the Israeli military response to October 7th. She wrote, "Side with the child over the gun every single time, no matter whose gun and whose child." And I think that's a powerful thing to say, right, to any audience. But again, the students, I've never heard anyone chant that or anything like that. They're going to do what they're doing. And so just looking ahead a little bit here, what seems clear to me, things that have changed for better or for worse here, is one that in Hebrew there's a word hasbara. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it means essentially information warfare. And for generations, like most governments, the Israeli government has engaged in information warfare, which is trying to spin things and to intimidate opponents and critics of their policy and all of that. Well, I don't think it's very effective anymore. It has been effective in the past. It can be very intimidating to see your name on lists of people who are listed as anti-Semites because you criticized, an Israeli policy or so. It can have a chilling effect. Back in the 80s and 90s, there was a group called Campus Watch, which would make lists of professors who gave lectures or taught classes in a manner that this right-wing pro-Israel group said is anti-Semitic or so. And basically, it was professors who talked about Palestinian rights, right? But they would make those lists. Now there's one called Canary Mission. The students at Mary Washington who are protesting for for Palestinian rights are being doxxed right now by this group, this online group. If you're older like me, I don't really give a rat's ass anymore, but when you're 18 or 20, you know, it can be really intimidating to have someone put your name and your address and all of this up online and say these people are anti-Semitic and whatnot. They don't seem to care that much. You know, when I was thinking about doing a PhD in the 1990s, a friend of mine, a Jewish professor at Georgetown, who I met through working with Palestinians, told me, "Great, Ranjit, go do your PhD, but whatever you do, don't do your PhD on Palestine and Israel." And I asked him why, and he said, "You'll never get a job. You will never get an academic job, because whenever you do it, whatever you write and whatever job talks you make, you're going to piss off half of the room, right? And they'll never hire you." And that was the chilling effect, right? You know, it was just, people wouldn't do it. Now, I don't think you see that much. I mean, it's still very controversial in some ways, but I think that kind of intimidation isn't working as much. And of course, there's a downside to that. And the downside is that anti-Semitism is very virulent, right? You know, there is a lot of anti-Semitism out, and it is rising, just like Islamophobia and things like that. So that means that some people who probably are anti-Semites and are criticizing Israel or something like that are getting away with it and not having their anti-Semitism called out. But it's been such a blanket charge for so long that anyone who criticizes Israeli state policies is anti-Semitic that it seems to have lost its force. Just a couple other points. I think for the younger people in particular, kind of that older perception of Israel as having a strong claim to some sort of moral virtue has been lost. And I don't think that will come back anytime soon. And again, we're speaking about perceptions here. And if you look at the Israeli government, I think that's, over the last 25 years, I think that's largely a self-inflicted blow. We have the most right-wing government in the history of Israel. It has shown no interest in a peace process since the mid-1990s. It has actively been anti-peace process. And I understand, I think, why that is so, because in the absence of peace, they are winning. They're getting more land. And they have a very long-term project, which is to get more land. And there's, you know, in politics, there are brutal kind of calculations, like how many conflicts can you afford to get to the goal that you want? And Netanyahu has been spearheading this desire to build more settlements. He was the fiercest critic of the Oslo Peace Accords back in the 1990s. He was one of the architects of ensuring that that didn't continue. But he also has useful allies in the Arab Gulf states and you know, Trump and including some Democrats as well, who have been willing to ignore over the last 25 years any Palestinian voices. They were shut out of any political process in the Middle East for the last 20, 25 years, and they're fully aware of that. When Trump negotiated the peace deal with the UAE and the Saudis and all of that, they called it the Abraham Accords. It was about Israel and Arab relations, and there was zero place for Palestinians in it. What do you think? They're just going to disappear? They're just going to sit on their hands and say, "We are invisible now." You know, it's not going to happen, right? You know, and so, you know, there's a lot of reasons why we don't have a peace process. I don't put it all on the Israeli government, but that has been, I think, a big thing. And then probably the most, and I think you guys already know this or have thought about this, but probably the most, from the American perspective, the most worrisome aspect of this is that you know, the Netanyahu government is trying to kill its way to security, and you can't do that. It's just not going to happen. And in fact, I think security for Israel in the long term is far worse now than it was on October 6th, in a lot of ways. This level of killing is it's not going to sit, right? New generations of terrorists and whatnot are being made right now. And since the weapons being used are American weapons, I'm sincerely worried about blowback on this, on the United States. I can't imagine from a Gazan, Palestinian, or any Palestinian perspective, you know, they've often seen America in an ambivalent way, but a rather nuanced way, which was that they knew America was, from the Palestinian perspective, a political opponent, not a virulent political opponent, but a political opponent in that it was allied with Israel, their opponent. But at the same time, they also admired America in a lot of ways, which is why we have Palestinians in the United States and all of this, right? They often want to come to the United States. And I've always found Palestinians very able to make a distinction between American governmental policy, which they didn't like, and American people and all that, you know, that kind of necessary nuance that we all feel when Trump is president or something like that, right? You know, but I don't know if that nuance can carry on anymore because these are American bombs killing a lot of Palestinians. And any soft power we have, any influence, any ability to bring people together in the Middle East is probably lost for the foreseeable future right now. We've taken such a hard stance on this right there. So on that rather depressing note, I'll shut up for now. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we'll take some questions.
Yes, please, sir.
Yeah, please wait for the microphone.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I had heard that at one time Israel was giving money to Hamas to weaken the PLO. Mm-hmm. Is that a true statement?
I don't know about the money itself, right? Because who knows, you know, how money moves around, and you can send money directly or indirectly through all kinds of ways. So I don't know about the money itself. There's a very clear pattern, though, if you go back to the 1980s, of Israeli policy supporting the development of what became Hamas, okay? And there's a long history to that. But Hamas is the Palestinian expression of a much larger, much older group found throughout most of the Middle East called the Muslim Brotherhood. It goes back to Egypt in the 1920s. And the Muslim Brotherhood takes on a different kind of flavor in each Arab Muslim country. In Palestine, it became known as Hamas. And back in the 1980s, when Israeli governments, they didn't really want to deal with the PLO, right? That was their arch enemy, was Arafat and the PLO. So they practiced what was probably a very logical thing to do, strategy, which is divide and conquer, right? You know, if you see the PLO as a powerful entity that is starting to gain some support in the West and making noises about, you know, a peace process and maybe recognizing Israel and all these kinds of things, as was happening in the late 80s, early 90s. They started to support the PLO's chief rival within Palestinian society, which was Hamas. And the ways that I do know that they supported the rise of Hamas, for example, in the occupied territories in West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, you cannot build without an Israeli building permit, right? Because they're under military occupation. So if you're a Palestinian wanting to build something like this, you have to get through the Israeli military government of occupation. They have an administrative bureaucracy. You have to get a building permit, right? So the Israelis get to choose who can build things and who cannot. And they would allow Hamas leaders to build mosques. And it's very hard to get permission to build from the Israelis, right? But they would allow them to build mosques. And the mosque is the center of authority, of administration for a movement like Hamas, right? They would allow them to build clinics and hospitals and things like that, because the way things work in the Palestinian occupied territories, probably to the detriment of the Palestinian cause, is that a lot of these public, kind of quasi-public buildings community buildings are politicized. I'm trying to think of a really good example of that. It could be something like a school or a clinic or so. It's often known that this building belongs to this political faction, right? So the PLO was made up of 12 or 13 different political factions, and some were more left of center, some were more nationalist or communist or whatever, and they would each have their little clinics in their schools and things like that. That was the way for that faction to show its support and its roots in the community. So Palestinians would know, if you built a building like this, oh, this belongs to Arafat's faction, or it belongs to some communist faction, or some this and that group, there's so many of them, some nationalist faction. Well, the Hamas faction was allowed to build a lot of these kinds of things. And Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, its mother organization, their strategy towards gaining support among the local population actually does not start with a militant strategy. It starts with a good work strategy. And so what they try to do is show that they are responsive when there is a fire or an earthquake or anything like that, right? They provide blankets. When women are pregnant and can't afford good medical care, they provide clinics at no cost or at a cost that someone can afford. These kinds of good works, that's how they attract followers and get support within a community. And so when Israel in the 1980s and early 1990s was allowing Hamas to build up this kind of infrastructure and disallowing other Palestinian factions to do that, and sometimes bulldozing what they had already done, they created this opportunity for Hamas, and that was very intentional. They knew what they were doing because they didn't see Hamas as the threat that the PLO was perceived to be at that time. Yeah, so they're picking and choosing within Palestinian society. I'm sorry, I'm getting over a cold a bit, so my voice is inconsistent.
Two quick questions. You mentioned a source of history. Is that a public website that we could access?
The one I was talking about, the DOD?
Yes.
Yeah. I don't have it on the top of my head, but I think it's probably this simple. If you go to the DOD's, I think it's called the Department of the Historian or something like that, and you type in list of wars, Indian wars or something like that. You'll find it. It's a long list.
Last question.
Yes.
Has there ever been any real support in Israel, the government, or the people for the so-called two-state solution?
I think there has been. Yeah, that's a great question. And, I feel a little bit nervous answering it because I haven't looked at, public opinion surveys or something like that historically. But that was the expectation certainly in the 1990s in the Oslo Peace Accords, which were designed around a two-state solution. They were designed to take baby steps towards a two-state solution. It's what they call the confidence-building approach, right? So instead of dealing with the really difficult issues that they knew would be the hardest to negotiate between Palestinians, then represented by the PLO and Yasser Arafat and the Israeli government, the most difficult issues were always going to be the status of Jerusalem, the status of Palestinian refugees, maybe some water issues as well, right? Those were just really tough existential kind of issues, right? So the Oslo Peace Accords were designed to take baby steps. Let's just keep taking baby steps, right? And the theory was if the Israelis pull back from Palestinian land, internationally recognized Palestinian land, and the Palestinians administer those lands in ways that are not threatening to the Israelis and things like that, you build up public trust and confidence, and then maybe in 5 or 10 years you can start negotiating the big issues, right? And the vision was then you end up with two states. Now, part of what killed it was political violence. In fact, the major thing that killed it, because actors were cut out, right? These were direct negotiations between the Israeli government at the time, which was really led by Rabin, Prime Minister Rabin, and the PLO. And groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad and some of these other groups were cut out of the process, right? And so those groups saw this peace process as illegitimate. They believed that they had a legitimate voice that was not being listened to. They also disagreed with the premise of the peace process. They said, all of this land is ours. It is non-negotiable. You saw that on the Israeli right as well, by the way, by some of the more hard-wing settler movements and things like that. They said this is, the problem with this, the structural problem is on the far right of both of these societies. You have groups who are saying, God tells us we must do this, and we cannot negotiate it, right? There's nothing negotiable if you believe you are doing God's will, right? And divine will. And so anyone who is negotiating over that is a target. And any process that is following on those negotiations based on ultimately a compromise on land is a target. It's illegitimate in their view. So what did you see? In 1995, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a right-wing Israeli who believed he was doing God's will because Rabin was seen as a traitor to those Israelis who believed all of this God has given to us. So even for an Israeli to negotiate it, that is traitorous. What did you see from the Palestinian militant side? Groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad started blowing up buses in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and all of that, slaughtering Israelis by the dozens, right? And the reason they were doing that is they wanted to end a gradual confidence-building process. They knew how this was designed to work, and if you could kill public trust in this system, as they very effectively did, there was a point by 96, 97, where Israelis could look at each other and say, we're not gaining from this peace process anymore. And Palestinians could say, we're not gaining from this, right? And so that was, I think, the larger story of why Oslo fell apart, in addition to other stuff. Some people exploited that as well, and it also leads to the issue that if there is going to be a peace process in the future, the leaders of all sides, I think, have to understand that it will be attacked viciously. It will be. And there will be a very high civilian toll to get to peace. There's just no other way around it. The real tragedy from the Israeli side was that Rabin was assassinated, and as a general and all of that, I think he understood that and he was willing to pay the cost. But in an elected system of government, you don't win votes with body counts, right? So it's going to be hard. It's a dark, kind of image I project. I realize that. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you, Kristen. I appreciate it. Yeah.
My papers. Okay, so hard left. Why do I give money to here? Okay. And I talked a little bit about this last year. When I moved to Fredericksburg, I just finished my master's degree. I got a job at UMW, mostly because it came with an apartment. Yeah. I was very worried about how do you negotiate housing? I've still never signed a lease. So because it came with an apartment, I got paid nothing. Yeah. So stumbled my way in here because my grandmother always told me when you move to a new place, you make friends by going to church. So I did. And that was fairly effective. And then over time, being someone who was here basically by myself, yeah, it was through coming to this building and meeting people that I found the resources to get through some really, pretty terrible things that happened. And these, like the people in this room were people that I would call when I needed someone and when I needed a place to sleep on a couple of occasions. And without the sustaining of this building, we aren't going to be able to provide those connections to people. So for those of us, myself included, who have made the connections with this community through coming to this building by stumbling in and building up that network, have gratitude for that. And we give in order to provide that opportunity for other people. So when I did that back then, and looking at the sheet and thinking about how much money this was proposing me to give and knowing how much money I made, that was pretty, I sat down with Ron Wassam and figured out a plan that was gonna work for me. And then over time, as my finances got a little more stable, I increased that. And then I went back for my doctoral degree. And when I made that decision, I made it on my own. And then the wonderful person that I was seeing at the time, we got married, which made that dream a little more sustainable. And talking about this community and what it meant to me, even though he is very happy to never come to a religious service for the rest of his life. Seeing the value in having a group of people that care about the two of us just because we are us, has value for him and for me. So we made the commitment to continue to give what we were giving when I was making 4 times as much as I do right now. So please consider what the connections that you've built here mean to you, how you could possibly put that into a monetary value, and what it would mean in order to sustain this community for other people. So we are going to do the offering. So don't think about that as you give here today, because that's a lot. But as you leave, there are forms in order to think about over the next year what seems reasonable and sustaining for both us and for you. So, when you give to the UFF, you help us to nurture learning, inspire spiritual insights, and lovingly transform our community and the world. For those gathered in person, greeters will be coming around with baskets for donations. All are also invited to donate via text messages to the number that will be on the screen. And you may also give by going to the website uuffxbg.org/giving. Our offertory will now be given and received.
We are one in the spirit, we are one in the flesh, we are one in the spirit, we are one in the flesh, and we pray that our unity may one day manifest, and we'll know we're united by our love, we will know we're united by our love. We will work with each other, we will work side by side, we will work with each other, we will work side by side, we will guard each one's dignity and save each other's pride, and we'll know we're united by our love, we will know we're united by our love. We will walk with each other, we will walk hand in hand, we will walk hand in hand, and together we'll spread the news that love wins in the end, and we'll know we're united by our love, by our love. We will know we're united by our love.
May all that has been shared and freely given here help us to grow in generosity and caring for the world of which we are a part.
Good morning. My name is Bill Brooks, and I'm a member of the pastoral care team. My pronouns are he and him. As a caring community, we share these personal matters that one of us would like the community to hold in our hearts. We have several concerns this morning. Tony Boring asked that we keep his wife in our thoughts as she recovers from surgery that she received recently. Jesse Johnson asked for our open hearts. He says, I learned yesterday that a friend I've known for 18 years took his own life last week. He often talked to me about the physical pain he lived with. I wish that I could have listened to him more deeply. And I would like to share with this community a concern for Ray Davis. He fell earlier this week and is again hospitalized because of that fall. He's open to visitors. I invite you to go by if you feel like you have the time and energy. And I also have a joy. My 3 personal markers for spring occurred this week. On Monday, the peas went into the ground. And this week, the daffodils began to bloom. And the peepers, I don't know what they're really called, but the tree frogs started to sing. So spring has begun for me. So you're invited at this time to come forward and silently place a pebble into the bowl for any joys and concerns that you are holding in your heart.
There is grace enough, there is love enough for all of us. There is mercy enough, there is grace enough, there is love enough for all of us. There is mercy enough, there is grace enough, there is love enough for all of us.
Our Our closing words this morning are by Stephen R. Papa. If we would but allow the majesty of creation to be, it would bless us. If we would incorporate the myriad aspects of creation instead of trying to incarnate them, the war would end. And if we would accept ourselves, maybe then we could accept others. If all these questions add up to confusion, all the answers add up to one affirmation. Love life, and it will bless you. Please join me in reading our words for extinguishing the chalice. We extinguish this chalice, but not the light of love and service. May it be a catalyst for spiritual growth and social justice as we carry it outside these walls into the world we live in until we are together again. Go in peace, serve the world, return again in love.